Hello and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who don't know, my name is Colleen and welcome to my mid-year wrap-up. So before I get into it, just want to quickly say that hi, I work for Chapters Indigo. Sometimes I get arcs from them. That's it. I do need to say that in my videos when I'm talking about arcs and other things related to work. But without further ado, let's get into what I have behind me. So I'm just going to break down some statistics about what I've read, and then show you what all the books that I've read, and then talk some more about some statistics. Sound good? Sound good. Okay, so between January 1st and June 30th, I read a total of 79 books, which is great. That is about 27,021 pages, which makes an average of 149 pages a day. So in January, I read 9 books. In February, I read 8 books. In March, I read 10 books. In April, I read 15 books. In May, I read 22 books. And in June, I read 15 books. So obviously these stacks don't include my larger format books. They are still all over my bed. And I tried to sub in books of a similar size for the library books that I no longer have. This stack might still be a little bit too high, but I did read a lot of graphic novels in May. So it kind of gives you an idea of the page count per month as well, which is kind of cool. So now on to every book that I read so far this year. I started off the year by reading The Red Queen's Daughter by Jacqueline Kolsov, and I rated it 4 stars. Then I read Saga Volume 7 by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples, and I rated this 3 stars. Next, I reread A Madness of Angels by Kate Griffin, and I rated this 3 stars also. Next, I read Murder of a Snake in the Grass by Denise Swanson. I rated this 3 stars, and it is the 5th book in the series, I believe. I followed that up with Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. This is the first in the Grisha trilogy, and I rated it 3 stars. Then I read Bird's Eye View, which is volume 7 of Lumberjanes, and I rated that 3 stars. Next, I read Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. This is the 2nd book in the Hannibal series, and I rated it 4 stars. Then I read Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, and I rated that 2 stars. And to wrap up January, I read To Hold the Bridge by Garth Nix, and I rated that 3 stars. Starting off February, I read The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, and I rated that 4 stars. Next, I read The Manticore by Robertson Davies. I rated this 4 stars also, and it is the 2nd book in the Deptford trilogy. Then I read The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan. This is the 3rd book in the Wheel of Time series, and I rated that 5 stars. Then I read The Last Mrs. Parrish by Liv Constantine, and I didn't like it. I rated it 1 star. I followed that up with The Omen Machine by Terry Goodkind, and I rated that 3 stars. Next, I read We That Are Left by Claire Clark, and I rated that 3 stars. Next, I read Tess of the Road by Rachel Hartman, and I rated that 5 stars. And I finished off February by reading Arrival by Ted Chiang, and I also rated that 5 stars. On to March. I started March off by reading Bitter Orange by Claire Fuller, and I rated that 3 stars. Then I read Hannibal by Thomas Harris, which is the 3rd book in the Hannibal series, and I rated that 3 stars. Then I read Wonder Woman Volume 3, The Truth, and I rated this 4 stars. Next, I read Rebel of the Sands by Alwyn Hamilton, and I rated that 3 stars. I followed that up with Galapagos by Kurt Vonnegut, and I rated that 3 stars. Then I read Paper Girls Volume 5, and I rated that 4 stars. Then I read God's Mercies by Douglas Hunter, and I rated that 3 stars. Then I read one of my favorite books of that month, which was The Colorist Chizuki Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage by Haruki Murakami, and I rated that 5 stars. Then I read my first library book of the year, Traitor to the Throne, and I rated that 4 stars. And I finished the month off with The Queen of Atolia by Megan Wallen Turner. This is the second book in the Queen's Thief series, and I rated that 4 stars also. In April, I started off the month with a library book, and I read Hero at the Fall, which I rated 4 stars. Then I read Unmentionable by Teresa O'Neill, and I rated that 3 stars. Then I followed up with another graphic novel, and I read Black Widow Volume 2, A Tightly Tangled Thread by Edmonston Noto and Gradas, and I rated that 3 stars. Then I read The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce, and I rated that 2 stars. Then I read 2 more library books. So the first one I read was Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo. It's the second in the Grisha trilogy, and I rated that 3 stars. And I followed that up immediately with Rune and Rising, which I also rated 3 stars. Then I read The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, and I rated that 4 stars. And after all that, I switched it up again with another graphic novel, and I read Darwin, An Exceptional Voyage, which I rated 4 stars. Next, I read one of my favorite books so far this year, which is Golden Hand by Garth Nix, and I rated that a 5 stars. After that, I read another library book, which was 3 Bags Full by Leonie Swan, and I rated that 4 stars. It was absolutely charming. Then I read my first arc of the year in How Not to Die Alone by Richard Roper. I rated that 4 stars. Then I read another library book. I read Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, and I rated that 3 stars. To get towards the end of the month, I read another YA fantasy in Wicked Lovely by Melissa Marr, and I rated that 2 stars actually. Next I read Taxidermy, and that is by Alexis Turner, and I rated that 4 stars. It was a beautiful book. And I rounded out the month by reading Shadow of Night by Deborah Harkness, and I rated that 4 stars. So I read quite a few library books in May. I started out the month by reading Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, and that's the second book in that duology, though I hear it might be a trilogy now, and I rated that 3 stars. Next I read another arc. I read Lanny by Max Porter, and I rated that 4 stars, though I felt like there were bits of it that I didn't get. Then I read 3 graphic novels. I read Giant Day Volume 2, which I rated 3 stars, Giant Day Volume 3, which I rated 4 stars, and Giant Days Volume 4, which I rated 3 stars, and those are all by John Allison. Then I read A Morbid Taste for Bones by Ellis Peters. This is the first book in the Cadefeld Mystery series, and I rated that 3 stars. I followed that up with another arc, The Scholar by Dervla McTurnan, and I rated that 4 stars. Then I picked up a short story collection. I read Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado, and I rated that 3 stars. Next I read Still Life. I did get this out from the library, but have since bought it, by Louise Penny. This is the first book in this series, and I rated it 4 stars. Next I read Ophelia by Lisa Klein, and I rated that 3 stars. Then I read another 3 graphic novels. I read Giant Days Volume 5, which I rated 3 stars, Giant Days Volume 6, which I rated 4 stars, and Giant Days Volume 7, which I rated 4 stars. Then I switched it up with a cozy and read Double Booked for Death by Allie Brandon. This is the first in the Black Cat Bookshop Mystery series, and I rated that 4 stars. Then I read a library book, and that was Redwall by Brian Jakes, which I rated 4 stars. Then I read another 3 graphic novels. I read Goldie Vance Volume 1, which I rated 4 stars. Princeless Volume 1, Save Yourself by Jeremy Whitley, which I rated 4 stars. And Rebel Without Applause, which is the first volume of The Backstagers by James Tyron IV, which I rated 3 stars. Then I tackled The Fires of Heaven by Robert Jordan, which does not fit in the frame, and I rated that 3 stars. Then I read another arc. I read The Farm by Joanna Ramos, which I rated 3 stars. Then I read From Here to Eternity by Caitlin Doherty, which I rated 4 stars. And I finished off the month by reading yet another library book. I read Three Dark Crowns, which I also rated 4 stars. So we're on to the last month in this video, June. And to start off the month, I read The Gentle Art of Swedish Death Cleaning by Margareta Magnusson. I can't pronounce that right. I rated it 2 stars. I didn't like it. Then I read a library book. I read The Ruin by Dervla McTernan. That is the first book in that series that I read the ARC copy of, and I really enjoyed it. It will be something that I add to my collection. I rated it also 4 stars. Then I read an ARC. I read The Poison Thread by Laura Purcell. I enjoyed this. I rated it 4 star. Then I read my favorite book of that month, which was Terrier by Tamora Pierce, and I rated that 5 star. Then I read a library book. I read The Bone Witch by Rin Chapeko. It's the first book in that series, and I rated it 4 stars. Then I read a graphic novel. I read Captain Marvel Volume 1, Earth's Mightiest Hero, and I rated that 4 star. I followed that up with Behemoth by Scott Westerfield. This is the second book in the Leviathan series, and I rated that 4 star. Then I read another library book. I read Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I rated it 3 star. It was probably my most disappointing read so far this year. Then I read The Porpoise, which arguably is the book that I liked the least this year, by Mark Haddon, and I rated it 2 star, or at least the second least. Then I finished Voyaging by Danet Brown. This is the first book in a Charles Darwin biography duology, and I rated that 4 stars. Earlier in the month, though it's out of order now, I did read Death Note Volume 1 by Tsugumi Oba and Obata. Yeah, so those names didn't get pronounced right. I rated it 4 stars and I really enjoyed it. Then I read Bunny by Mona Allwood. I got this as an ARC and I rated it 4 stars. Then I read another graphic novel that I got out from the library. I read Giant Days Volume 8 by John Allison and I rated that 4 stars. And then I finished off the month with 2 more library books. I read One Dark Throne, which is the second book in the Three Dark Crowns series by Kendar Blake, and I rated that 3 stars. And I read King of Scars, which is the first book in the Nikolai duology by Leigh Bardugo, and I rated that also 3 stars. So I read 50 books that were in series this year. Only 12 of those 50 books had I read from that series before, and the other 38 were new series to me, so that would include sequels in those as well, because it had been the first time that I read from them, and 3 of those were rereads for me. This would mean that I read 20 standalones and 6 ARCs. So other things that have gone really well for me this year, I read 40 out of the 54 books that I had on my TBR, so that means that I read all except for 1 of my Star Jar picks as well, which I think is really great. So far this year, I have read 28 books by men, 10 that were collaborative, that were mostly graphic novels, so aren't going to be represented in this visual, and that means that I read 41 books by women. Very interesting to note that outside of graphic novels, I only got 1 book out from the library by a male author, and almost every other one was by a female author. Just a fun thing to notice. So moving on to our star ratings, I rated only 1 book 1 star. I rated 5 books 2 stars, 31 books 3 stars, 36 books 4 stars, and 6 books 5 stars. Although I could stack both of these and still be in frame like one on top of the other, it was a little dangerous, but like generally that is the sort of curve that I'd like my ratings to have, so I'm very happy with that. So now into both my favorite and least favorite part, genres. I thought I would start off with the one that I had the least number of books read in, and that is sci-fi. I have only read 1 sci-fi this year, and it is Behemoth by Scott Westerfield. Tied for second least, I have classics, which I read 3 of. Not really sure if the Screwtape Letters count as a classic, but I counted it. Then I also read 3 thrillers. Again, is Hannibal a thriller? I like to think so. And finally, short stories, which I read 3 of. Moving on, just because they are quite heavy. I did read 1 manga this year. I only read Death Note Volume 1 so far, anyways. And 17 graphic novels, which are very heavy. So those are going to go back. I read 5 historical fiction, 6 mysteries, only 2 of which were cozies. Well, I guess 3. 3 cozies. 6 nonfiction, 9 literary fiction, and the remaining 25 books were all. So surprising no one, I read majority of books targeted towards adults at 47 books, 37 books targeted towards YA, or 13 plus, 1 library book targeted towards middle grade. So like every year, I read majority American authors. Not a surprise there. I read from 19 British authors, 8 Canadian authors, 2 Japanese authors, 4 books by Australian authors, by an Israeli author, Sleep Bardugo. So I read 1 library book by a French author, 1 book by a Swedish author, 1 library book by a Filipino, 1 book by a Spanish author, 1 book by a German author, and 1 book by an Irish author. And finally, I couldn't figure out what country this author was from, so that was that. But that's still 12 different countries that I read from. And that about wraps it up for my mid-year wrap-up. I'm pretty pleased how I've done, even though I felt quite slumpy in June. But let me know if you have any of the questions about any of the books featured in this video. I'm happy to chat about any and all of them. And stay tuned for more monthly wrap-ups and stuff like that. I will link the link to my playlist and my playlist for my reading vlogs and my monthly wrap-ups down below if you're looking for any more information on any of these books. I go into more depth for most of them in one or the other. Yeah, that's it. I'll see you in 6 months for another wrap-up with more statistics like this.